Right, good morning everyone. Lovely to see everyone again for another Zoom on with the Jill Dando News Centre. Thank you everyone for being so prompt and everything, and thank you again for all the work you've done over these last few weeks on Zoom. Been fantastic, really impressed. So today, without much further ado, we're very pleased to welcome our two fantastic local MPs. So we've got Mr. Penrose, who's the MP for Western, excuse me, and Mr. Heappey, who's the MP for Wells. So no doubt they will both introduce themselves and tell you lots and lots about what they do. Is it right? I'm saying it's Henry, I think, and Poppy today who are going to lead this through. So I'm handing now straight to Henry or Poppy. So over to one of you guys. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
I'll take it first. Welcome. Hello.
Hello.
Everyone has prepared questions for you two, and this is Jill Dando TV, and I think I'll start with my question for both of you. Because of isolation, Brexit has kind of been forgotten. Do you think it will continue after quarantine, and do you think now is a bad time to leave the EU as of the coronavirus?
Henry, look, we've already left the EU, I'm afraid. We left on the 31st of January, so that bit's already done. I think what you mean is whether or not we should end the transition period still at the end of the year. I sort of think we do, I'm afraid. Well, why am I afraid? I think we have to. I think lots of people will be very cross at us if we don't. And I think that if we volunteer to take longer, I think that rather just takes the pressure off from the negotiations. And I think we need to try and drive the negotiations on at best speed. But John might not agree. I think there'll be difference of opinion within Parliament on that.
I think James is right that there'll be differences of opinion. I do agree with James, though, and it's interesting because I think James and I both voted originally 3 years ago to remain. I think I'm right about that, James, aren't I? Is that right? Yeah. So we both voted to remain, but we both think that now the country's voted to leave, we've got to crack on with it. And it's not easy. So you're absolutely right to ask the question. And I think that the coronavirus lockdown has actually made the negotiations about the sort of second step. James is right, we've legally left, we've still got to work out how we exit the transition phase, is what we're in now. And it made doing those negotiations for the sort of long-term trade agreement, which is what we've got to get to now to end the transition phase, has made those harder. So you're absolutely right to ask the question. And quite a few, I mean, I'm getting some emails, I don't know if James is, from constituents saying, well, does this mean we should sort of take it a bit slower? And I understand why they're asking the question, because it's made life more difficult because of all this lockdown stuff that's going on. But also, you know, there's an awful lot of people out there who are really worried that this might be used as an excuse for not really leaving at all, or only ending up sort of having done the phase one leaving and not finishing the job. And you know, we've had 3 years of real wrangling and sort of and people getting really, you know, into a sort of gridlock, a deadlock over the last 3 years until the general election last December about leaving. And I just think that after all that ill feeling, after all that division, after all that upset, if we now don't finish the job, there's going to be an awful lot of people who are going to say, here, oh, hang on a sec, we told you so, and now you're grabbing opportunities not to leave. I think we've got to do it.
Good morning, Mr. Penrose and Mr. Heappey. Thank you for giving your time up to be with us today. I'll be co-hosting this interview for the Jill Dando TV. So my question is for James, and it's, why did you decide to campaign to be the local MP for the Conservative Party when you could have chosen any other party?
Well, because I'm a Conservative, and I think that when you work out whether you're going to get into politics, you have to first of all work out, do you have politics that align with any party? And if you don't, then you might choose to stand as an independent candidate. But if you broadly agree with the views of one party over the others, then that sort of leads you to join that party. And the value of being a member of a political party and being elected into Parliament as a member of a political party is that, you know, if you want to really make a difference, then you need your party to get into government. And that, I think, is that requires lots of people who are of similar minds to come together, form a party, campaign together with the same message across the country, and then hope to be able to form a government in order to be able to deliver that change. So I wasn't massively into politics when I was serving in the army. I was quite interested in it when I was younger, but I only joined the Conservative Party when I decided I was going to try and stand for Parliament. But I think people sort of are slightly shy nowadays. They try and sort of say, "Oh, I'm not particularly political. I'm not, but I am. I mean, I am a Conservative. I believe very much in the freedom of the individual. I believe very much in the free market. I believe very much that if you work hard, you should be able to succeed. And there are lots of other people like me around the country, and I feel very comfortable being a part of this party and serving for it, with it, in Parliament on your behalf as your MP.
Okay, so shall we go on to Archie?
Hi, my question is for John. How can Weston-super-Mare and Burnham-on-Sea invite people for day trips when all of our public toilets are closed and most of our car parks? The only reason I ask this is because yesterday we were out on our exercise and we saw lots of dangerous and illegal parking.
Yeah, a really important question, and it's something which has been replicated in other, not just seaside resorts around the country, you know, from Devon through to Essex, but also there's been a whole series of other tourism destinations, you know, stately homes and gardens and that sort of stuff, where I think there have been other concerns similarly. Look, the point I've been making to both to the local council, but also to local police and everybody else, is what matters is when people, it doesn't matter if they're coming from miles away, it doesn't matter if they're coming from Birmingham or from, you know, 2 miles down the road, when you get to wherever it is you're going on your visit, you know, with your picnic hamper, if that's what you've got with you, and you're with the rest of your family, what matters is, you know, are you behaving in a sensible way that is lining up with the social distancing rules? Are you keeping your 2 metre distance from people who aren't from your household and all that sort of stuff? If you are, then actually we can get, you know, seaside resorts, you know, at least partly reopened safely. But if you're not, it's all up to how people behave when they get there. If they are behaving that way, then it's a really dangerous thing to do. And so we've got to try and make sure that everybody just keeps their heads screwed on safely, that they park safely, that they behave safely when they get there, that, you know, if you're having a picnic or you're sitting on the beach, keep that 2 metre distance. And actually, quite a lot of the pictures that I've seen and the, you know, reports I'm getting from not just Western Beach, but other beaches around the country, is most people are doing the right thing. There's a few who aren't, either because they're parking indiscriminately or because when they get there they are not being sensible. When they go and buy fish and chips at one of the seafront eateries, they aren't necessarily queuing sensibly and they aren't keeping their distance in the queue and that sort of thing. But if people do behave the right way, then actually it can be done safely if we're all careful, if we stay alert, if we do the right thing. And if we do it that way around, actually, do you know what? It's really, really good for both people's, you know, mental health and, you know, combating loneliness and all those things. It's also quite good for the local jobs and economy. And because places like Burnham, places like Weston, certainly, you know, we need to get a bit of economic blood flowing through our veins again.
I think we'll go on to Freddie next. My question is for Mr. Heappey. What is the biggest thing you had to overcome in the army?
There's lots. I think it's it's actually not your own personal fear, I think, because you tend to be able to just block that out. I think probably maybe in Afghanistan 2009, we'd had a run of quite challenging patrols, quite a few people killed, quite a few people sort of had their legs blown off and stuff. And you reach the point where every night you've got to try and motivate the team to go out again, and they're all quite scared. And it's your job as the commander to try and sort of persuade them to go out again and to trust you that you've got a plan that's going to keep them as safe as they can possibly be, and that why you're going out is worthwhile. That's probably the hardest thing I had to overcome.
I think we'll go over to Tom next.
Hi there. This is a question for both of you. If your children were my age, would you be sending them back to school on the 1st of June?
I am. Yes.
Yeah. I guess I would too, but I would want to know that the school had a plan that was going to, deal with the social distancing and do it safely. Now, there's quite a lot of guidance that's coming out at the moment. I'm sure that Mr. Coles and the other teachers in the local trusts will be going through that in detail. Providing there's a plan in place to do it safely, then I am too.
And I should add, because John's just made me feel like a very irresponsible parent. Yes, he's absolutely right. I too would want to know that my children were going to be safe. But I spoke to Mr. Coles the other day, and he inspires confidence in that.
Yeah.
Likewise, I've spoken to lots of other heads around the constituency, and I think schools will be able to deal with this. It's not the whole school going back in one go, and I think that it's the right thing to do. I'm very comfortable sending my daughter, who's in year 1, back. My son, who's in year 3, won't get to go back because he's not one of the year groups that's being invited to return. But it's the right thing to do.
Next, we'll go to Emma Latchford.
Hi. My question is for both of you, and it's, what made you change your mind about Brexit?
So Emma, look, the thing that made me change my mind was the fact that the country voted. And it's one of those things where if you're a Democrat, whether or not you are on one side of a debate or the other side of a debate, when you have an election, call it a general election, call it a referendum, you've kind of got to accept the result, whether or not you were on whichever side you were on going into it. So every time somebody gets elected who isn't a Conservative, I have to accept that result, even if I don't agree with what people said and did and where they voted. And the result of the referendum was the same for me. So once the referendum result came in and the country had voted to leave, I had to sort of dust myself down and go, okay, that's what people want. It's the decision, and therefore we've got to get on with it. And I think we've got to deliver it. So I was one of the first MPs to stand up in Parliament afterwards and say, look, we've now got to do this, and we shouldn't muck around. We shouldn't backslide. We've got to get on with this. There's a huge amount of detail about how, not an easy thing to decide how, but we've got to get on with it. And I got quite upset with one or two of my other fellow MPs, not James. James was one of the ones who sort of was on side and got it as well. But one or two people were trying to backslide, and I just thought that was quite dangerous and wrong. And I think that voters got quite upset with some MPs behaving that way, and felt like they expected people, once they've been given an instruction, the voters are in charge in a democracy, and once the voters have decided what's going to go on, then you've got to get on and do it. James, I don't know if you would you probably disagree with all of that, but that's where I was, at least.
No, John, I don't at all. I'd agree entirely. I think that the key distinction is that in a referendum, you vote as an individual. Your vote, if you had been 18 on the date of the referendum, your vote as a private 18-year-old citizen in Weston or Burnham would have been worth exactly the same as mine as a Member of Parliament, because we were voting as individuals.
Yeah.
But thereafter, I was the representative of an entire community in Parliament, and I took very seriously that my job was to represent the will of that community and the will of the country as a whole. And for all of those who spent the last 2 or 3 years saying, but that's not the job of the MP, the job of the MP is to use their judgment, etc., etc. Well, you find me a single election leaflet from December, it's only 6 months ago, where anybody was writing on their leaflet, please vote for me so I can go to Parliament and do what I think best. Every single person who put a leaflet through your door will have written on their leaflet, I want to be your voice in Westminster. I want to serve this community. I want to be Wells's representative. It's not me, it's all for you. Well, if you're going to make that your pitch when you stand for Parliament, that you want to serve your community, represent their views, be their voice, you can't then change your mind or ignore their decision when acting on their behalf in Parliament. And so I take that very seriously. You're in a referendum, you vote as an individual. In Parliament, exactly as you say you'll do on your election leaflets, you are the representative of that community, you're their voice, and it's your job to make sure their voice gets heard.
So I think now we're going to move on to Shannon, and I think she has a question for both of you.
Yes, I have two questions. So I'll start with my question for Mr. Heappey. Given your military background, what's your opinion of how the coronavirus pandemic has been supported by the Ministry of Defence?
Well, I'm also now the Minister for the Armed Forces in the Ministry of Defence. So I think the Ministry of Defence has done a brilliant job in delivering military support for the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the ministerial decision-making has been timely and absolutely 100% right all of the time. Genuinely, to be working in the MOD at a time like this is quite extraordinary, because you just realise that, you know, our armed forces are just amazing. You turn around to them and say, we need to put 3 people alongside every local authority in the country to help them plan for whatever, whether that be getting meals to elderly people or care homes or PPE, whatever. And they just go, yeah, fine, done. And a week later, there are 3 really talented people sat alongside every local authority in the country. You turn around to them and say, we need to build a 2,000-bed hospital. Can you help plan that? A week later, the planning is underway. Contractors are engaged. You turn around to them and say, design mobile testing units. A week later, they come back and say, Minister, here's the plan. And away they go. And there are now 100 of those. It's the most extraordinary, like, just working in an environment that is that can do, where the answers never no, really. It's always sort of, yeah, okay, Minister, we'll see what we can do. And they come back, and it's amazing. I hope that, quite rightly, it's the NHS doctors, nurses, it's our care workers who get the applause every Thursday night. They deserve it. They're the ones who are really exposing themselves to risk. But our armed forces have been amazing during all of this, and I'm very proud to be the minister that represents them in government and to have played a small part in that response.
Thank you, because my mum works for the MOD as well, so I understand where you're coming from. My second question is for Mr. Penrose. How do you feel the government is supporting the country's economy, and how will they sustain the balance between health and wealth?
Crumbs, really important point that. I mean, can I just follow up by just saying, I thought James' answer was bang on that last point about the armed forces. Their attitude and reactions have been amazing. In terms of what we're doing for the economy, this is really important, because actually the lockdown's been essential to get the spread of the virus under control, but it has really bad effects, not just for jobs and our economy, but it also has really bad effects socially too. So what it means is that quite a lot of people's jobs, people are worried that their jobs may not be there to come back to, and we've got to make sure that as many of them as possibly can be are there to come back to. But it also has an effect on loneliness. People who are on their own, loneliness is a big factor. You can have Zoom meetings like this, but it's only a partial solution. And it also, I'm afraid, has an impact on things like domestic violence and some kinds of crime as well. So the lockdown has real costs. And it's also true that if there's a cost in jobs, over the medium term, what that does is it makes the population less healthy in other ways than coronavirus does. So it has a real impact through poverty of hurting people's health over the medium term as well. So there's a health impact, which is sort of a different problem than coronavirus, but it's very, very real. So what the government's been trying to do is to kind of put the economy into hibernation for a couple of months, and to keep it alive but sort of sleeping until the lockdown is over, and then with any luck everyone can sort of wake up and go back to work. The danger, and it's a really serious danger, is that costs a heck of a lot of money and it doesn't work perfectly. It'll work for some jobs but not for all of the others. And so one of the things that I've been saying, and a lot of other people have been saying too, is we have got to work out how to get back to work safely as soon as we can, because actually the government can only do so much to put the economy into hibernation. It doesn't work perfectly. Some firms won't wake up, some jobs won't be there when we get back. We've got to work out how to get back to work safely. And that's why, for example, the stuff we were just talking about beach fronts and getting beach resorts back up and running at least partially. That's just one example. Every single other part of our economy, the same calculation has to be done. We've got to get it done really fast and get people back to work as quickly as we can.
May I just ask about the furlough scheme, how you're managing it and how you think it will carry on and working?
Yeah, sure. So the furlough scheme's just been extended for a couple more months. But I think that there's a point at which people are going to start saying, do you know what, we can't furlough people forever, partly because it's taxpayers, it's your parents' taxes that have got to pay for the furlough, and that's a really expensive thing to do. They just published today, in fact this morning, some figures for government borrowing, and last month government borrowing was the highest ever. I mean, ever. No other month in the history of this country has been higher. That includes during the Second World War, it includes during the 2008 banking crash. So just shows how much it's costing us to do this as a country, as a society, and as taxpayers, and all that money's got to be repaid at some point in future. So we can't carry on doing it forever. But the furlough scheme, yeah, it's been extended for a couple more months, and that's one of the key ways of keeping jobs alive, even while companies are sort of stuck in hibernation. But it's not something we can do for very much longer. But it is being extended for a couple more months at least. But ultimately, the best answer is work out how to get people back to work safely, and then press the button and do it.
I think we're going to go on to Jack Maydew next.
Hello, my question is for James Heappey, and what is your most memorable sporting achievement?
Good question. My most memorable sporting achievement is so I'm torn between two. One was I got into rowing at university, and my university wasn't particularly good at rowing. Birmingham doesn't have a river, and we were the first Birmingham University crew ever to qualify for Henry Royal Regatta, and so to row there was quite special. Quite enjoyed that, and I also played a bit of golf, and I played with I went on a parliamentary visit to America and spent a weekend down in Florida with a congressman down there. There's a very famous golf course down there called the TPC at Sawgrass. And I was playing with a congressman, a United States judge, and a retired senator. And I got an eagle, which is 2 under par on one hole, on a very famous hole. And I reacted in a very unparliamentary way. I put my arms aloft and screamed very, very loudly indeed, much to the embarrassment of those I was playing with.
Thank you. I think we're going to go on to Olivia Montgomery next.
My question is for both of you, and it is, what is the biggest change that you have managed to influence whilst being an MP?
There's one local and one national, if I'm allowed two quick ones. The local one in Weston is, when I was first elected, Weston had a really big problem with drugs rehabs. There are some quite important drugs rehabs in Weston-super-Mare which do a really good job at helping people who are addicted to drugs get over their addiction and get their life back on track. But when I was first elected, there were some other ones that were not very good at all and were frankly not helping the addicts and not helping the people who lived near the addiction centres either. And they become hotspots for crime and medical problems and all sorts of other things as well. And one of the first things I did was when I first got elected, we stopped local authorities, councils around the country, sending people to those rehabs unless they were being properly run. and that forced the rehabs to either clean up or close down. And as a result, Weston now has fewer better rehabs, and that's better for the addicts and it's better for local residents as well. And that was a big change in the way that the town looked and felt, and it sort of helped the town rebound economically over the last decade or more as a result of that. So that was a local thing. Nationally, funnily enough, the thing which I'm most proud of is something which will take years and years to feed through. I was one of the people who helped set up something called English Heritage, and they own and run a whole series of really important historic sites, things like Stonehenge. Now, they've owned them for years, but we managed to split up English Heritage so that the properties they own are now being run separately from everything else that English Heritage used to do. And it's kind of become like a second national trust, and it's got some really, really important historic sites, and I helped set that up. I was the person who took the original decision to make the split, to set it up, to get it going. It probably isn't something which will make a huge difference in the short term, but your children and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and James's great-grandchildren, with any luck, it'll still be going in 100 years' time, and it'll still be something that's really important for the nation.
Good answers. Locally, I'm very pleased that 5 years of endless whinging about broadband and mobile phone coverage has meant that you can now drive across the Wales constituency and hold mobile phone coverage throughout. Indeed, you can drive through the Wales constituency and have Zoom coverage throughout. There's now about 80% plus of my constituents have got fibre, which is a lot better than it was 5 years ago. So that's the local thing. Nationally, net zero. I am hugely proud of being part of the Conservative Environment Network and part of a group of green Conservative MPs that lobbied hard and I think sort of won the argument, got the government to commit to net zero, which I think is the challenge of our times and will be really transformative.
We're now going to go on to Amy, please.
Hi, this question is for both of you. So I was just wondering, how are you always so prepared to be asked any hard questions by journalists?
I don't think we are. It's a constant state of utter terror that they're going to ask you something that you don't know the answer to, and it's hard because what you should do, the honest thing to do is say, I don't know the answer to your question. But of course, if you do that, the journalists, they want it both ways. Because if you say, if a politician says, I don't know the answer, they'll go nuts at you for not knowing. Say, well, you should know. But if you try and waffle them and try and pivot onto something you do know the answer to, they'll have a go at you for not answering the question. So who'd be a politician? Easier being a journalist.
I'd agree with James. That most politicians are therefore a mile wide and an inch deep. We have to know a bit about a heck of a lot of stuff, and you still get ambushed by stuff which is impossible to answer as well. But you also have to read incredibly widely as a result. But James is right. You can normally tell when a politician's in trouble, either because, as he says, they start waffling, or because they try and change the subject onto something that they are comfortable with. I think the thing which I've found is the best answer for journalists when you're asked something you don't know is to ask them a question about their question, and that normally shuts them up.
Thank you. I really enjoyed doing this today. I'm going to hand back over to Henry, if that's okay.
Next person we're moving on to will be Emma Hewson, I think.
Hi, my question's for Mr. Penrose. There's been a decline in shops in Weston High Street. Do you think it's time to abandon the traditional high street for a more accessible out-of-town shopping centre?
Blimey. Well, I agree with the first half of your question, which is you're absolutely right that Weston High Street, but actually high streets right the way across the country have been in sort of quite long-term decline. It isn't something which is unique to Weston. I'm sorry to say it's much bigger than that. And that's partly because of out-of-town shopping centres, places like Cribbs Causeway, but also, and they take customers away from the town centre and sort of suck the footfall away to mouth. But also online shopping is sort of the other big change, and that has meant that an awful lot of people don't go shopping in towns or even at Cribbs Causeway anymore. We just get on the screen and we shop online now. And in fact, the lockdowns made that happen even more. And I think what that therefore means is that neither of those two trends are likely to change in future. They're likely to carry on, and therefore town centres, whether it's Weston-super-Mare or anywhere else, have got to rethink what they're there for. Historians tell me, interestingly, that if you go back about 100 years, high streets weren't like what they've become now. If you go back 100 years, high streets were much, much more varied than they are now. They weren't just retail places where you went shopping. They were places where you'd find cobblers and people who actually did work, and they had the little workshops, and you'd find coffee shops, of course, which we've now got more of than we used to have, and people living above their shops as well. So there's an awful lot more home and housing in town centres and on high streets as well. So they're much more varied. Now, I don't think we can go back 100 years and redo that, but I do think that town centres and high streets are going to have to rethink themselves and work out what the new, much more varied version for the 21st century is going to look like. But I don't think, and the bit I sort of respectfully disagree with your question about, is the presumption that the answer is more out of town shopping centres, because I think that what that will do is it'll actually make the problems of town centre shopping centres even worse. So I think probably the answer is for town centres to rethink themselves and say, right, what do people want to do in town centres in the modern world in future, and what's that's going to look like, because it won't be the same as just a purely retail thing, which is this relatively recent last couple of decades or last half century that it's become in recent years.
Next will be Tamsin.
So my question to both of you, and it's, what would you say is the most important quality for a politician to have?
So a thick skin. I think that, and that brings with it a contradiction. You have to have a thick skin because for lots of people, you are the person to whom they go when every other part of the system has failed them and they're really cross and they need to vent, and you have to sort of absorb that and then move on to how you help them. There are lots and lots of people, maybe this is different to what it was like to be a politician 20 years ago, but nowadays, lots of people will just randomly decide to insult their MP, or even someone else, just jump up and insult any MP on social media, and you have to get used to just absorbing that and knowing that it's not reflective of the community's view as a whole. But the reason there's a contradiction in that is that if you have too thick a skin, then you can't pick up on the mood of the community you're supposed to be serving. And so you've got to be able to get out there, understand their frustrations, understand what it is that's making them cross, understand what it is that's making them happy, understand what they want from government. But at the same time, not to get bent out of shape by a very vocal minority who nowadays can very quickly amplify their opinions. And I think that our politics is much worse when our politicians find themselves getting bent out of shape by those small vocal minorities, rather than sort of seeking to understand what the community as a whole is thinking and to serve those who are genuinely in need.
I think that's right. The only thing I'd add to that is that I think politicians need to be really good at listening to what people want and working, and then they need to be incredibly persuasive. So if they need to have a thick skin, as James rightly says, not to get bent out of shape, then they need to work out, having not got upset, how they're going to persuade enough people to create a consensus behind whatever it is that needs to get done. And so you've got to be incredibly good at persuading people, and not just people who you like, not just people who you naturally feel at home with and naturally feel friendly towards, or they feel friendly towards you. People who maybe come from completely different backgrounds, have completely different opinions, would disagree with on all sorts of other things. But if you can persuade them, work out what it is that makes that person or that group of people tick, and then get them to come on side to back a particular issue, a particular idea, a particular cause that really desperately needs to change in order to make your constituents' lives better or the country's life better, that's a key skill, and not to let personalities get in the way of playing the ball, not the man or the woman, is difficult, but it's absolutely essential. As the sort of the second thing to do after you've after you've grown the thick skin that James rightly says you've got to have.
Before we move on, it's worth reflecting. Sorry, Henry. That it's such a sign of the times that John and I feel like that, because that shouldn't be how that it is, but it is. But our public discourse has just become so toxic. It's not much fun a lot of the time being in elected office because you just get abused. And I wonder, it's just an interesting thought for another day about sort of whether or not that's just the way that it is nowadays, but it puts an awful lot of people, especially women, off getting into public life, because first requirement is to be able to protect your emotions from people being rude at you all the time. Second requirement is to actually then get on and do politics and build consensus. It's just a sad thing to reflect on, and I think, Parliament will be a whole lot worse if good people who aren't willing to soak up the abuse decide not to go into politics.
Thank you for that. That was a good question. Next, we're going to be moving on to Katie.
Hello, Mr. Heappey and Mr. Penrose. My question is for both of you. If children could vote, what policies would you design so they would vote for you?
Well, I'll go first on this one since James went first on the last one. I'm afraid there's a really good example of this out there at the moment, because the single policy that most politicians default to in an attempt to get younger people under 18 to potentially vote for their party is to promise the vote to people who are under 18. I've got to say, I find, and you'll find quite a lot of people in other political parties doing this quite often. And the thing which just worries me about that is that it feels a bit sort of, it feels a bit opportunistic, frankly, because if you look at what the polling tells us, if you ask people who are 16 whether or not there should be votes at 16 rather than at 18, what the polling says is that people at 16 think it jolly well should be at 16, not at 18. I should lower the voting age. Ask people who are 17 if they think that people at 16 should be able to vote, and it's much more of an even split. If you ask people who are 18 or over, most polls show that they think there shouldn't be votes at 16 after all, which tells you something about how people view themselves when they were a bit younger than that. And I think it's just, therefore, it's a bit worrying that some politicians are more focused on trying to persuade people that they should vote for their particular political party than whether or not they should actually, whether or not the country thinks it's the right thing to do. But the conclusion that most politicians come to on that answer is promise them the vote and then they might vote for you, and rather than working out if it's the right thing to do for the country or working out what the right thing will be for other things for people of 16, 17, or even 11, 12, 13, what would actually be right for them.
So I very much agree with John on that, actually. I'm perfectly willing to listen to a debate and participate in a debate about bringing down the voting age. I know this wasn't your question, but it is, as John rightly points out, the policy that a lot of people offer up to young people. But I think we've got to look at it in the whole, because this becomes a debate around the point at which you reach adulthood and should have all the responsibilities for it. And who is the government to say you can vote at 16 for a government, but that government can then turn around and say you can't watch certain films, or you can't place up certain computer games, or you can't drink certain drinks, or that you can't get married without your parents' permission, or that you can't go to war to fight for the government and for the country that you voted for. So if we're going to create that age at 16, then fine. At 16, you are old enough to know what you should and shouldn't drink. At 16, you're old enough to know what you should and shouldn't watch on TV or at the cinema. At 16, you're old enough to know what games you should play, and You know, I think that that's the conversation, and very often those who get very misty-eyed about people voting at 16 are absolutely not willing to accept that people at 16 should be able to drink alcohol, play violent computer games, fight for their country, get married. So, you know, that's I think that's the debate that needs to be had. But I actually worry a bit when people talk about policies for young people. You know, promise to cancel tuition fees or promise them, you know, extra, more money for schools. I think that young people are just as motivated by the same things everybody else are. They want to live in a safe, prosperous society that is fair. They want to live in an environment where there's opportunity. They want to live in an environment that is where the environment itself is looked after. They want to see us decarbonise. And so the moment you start getting into that sort of sectional, well, here's my policy for old people, here's my policy for young people, here's my policy for women, that doesn't feel to me like a particularly coherent message. And so I would far rather try to persuade young people that the whole set of values and policies that me and my party stand for are the right values for them and their parents and their grandparents and for the country at large. And, you know, I'll leave others to do the bidding war over who can come up with the best gimmick.
Next, we are moving on to Olivia Finch.
Hello, Mr. Penrose and Mr. Heappey. My question is for both of you, and I was wondering if you find it difficult to deal with matters in your constituency which you don't have the same beliefs as, and if so, how do you combat this?
I mean, I think I don't find that friction, because I think that constituency work very often is people or groups or communities wanting your help with something that they can't get sorted on their own. And so very, very rarely does ideology, does your politics come into that. You're absolutely right that sometimes, there'll just be a petition put together by lots of people who disagree with government policy. And of course, you have to respect that they've taken the time to write that petition. And of course, you have to engage with them and listen to their concerns. But 500 people signing a petition that opposes the policy of the government that won a general election, of course, their 500 signatures don't undo the result of our democracy. So I think you sort of, when people come to you with a political demand, you have to point them in the direction of the election result. But 99% of the things that I do for my constituents, and I bet it's the same for every other MP, are not political. They're just about helping people to try and get something sorted.
Yeah, I'd strongly agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. And the only thing I'd add to it is to say, therefore, where you do get the political points which are less to do with constituency work and more to do with national politics on this or that issue, and people want, they've got a particular point of view, if you don't personally agree with it, the thing which I find is really difficult but really works, or is really necessary, doesn't always work, but it's usually necessary, is to be honest with them, say, look, I don't agree with you about this, but here's why. And if you give people a straight answer to a question, even if it's not, yes, of course, you're right, if you can do that in a respectful and sensible way, it goes back to the point we were talking about before about how do politicians deal with this conflict and people getting upset. If you can do that in a way that works, quite a lot of the time you get people saying, well, look, I don't necessarily agree with Mr. Penrose or Mr. Heappey about X, whatever it is, but actually he gave me a straight answer to a straight question. At least we can respect our differences, and that is perhaps the best thing you can leave them with as an experience at the end of that. So even if they say, well, I don't agree with you about this, but I do understand where you're coming from, and that's what democracy is. It's about debate at the end of the day.
Next, we will be moving on to Dawson.
Hi, Mr. Penrose. Hi, Mr. Heappey. My question is mainly aimed at Mr. Penrose, and it's as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think there'll be an increase in the use of technology? And what part do you think your wife, Baroness Harding's track and trace system will play as part of that movement?
So the answer to the first part of your question is, yes, I do think there's already been a huge increase in technology, actually. I mean, here we are having a conversation on Zoom. Most of us never heard of Zoom 3 months ago. And the whole country and many other countries around the world has started doing this kind of thing much, much more frequently than we were doing before. And that's going to make some huge differences to the way we live. Some of them are going to be really good, incidentally. So an awful lot of people have discovered that you don't need to commute into work every day. You can do some more things from home than you realized, and you can have more meetings like this than you realize. You can have more classes if you're a pupil or a student like this than perhaps we realized before as well. And what that's going to mean is that as a nation, once this is all over, I think there's going to be a new normal. And we aren't going to spend quite so much time in cars, traveling around and burning quite so much carbon. With any luck, our economy will be greener in some respects, at least. And I think that's a great thing. And that's just one example. So there's going to be lots of other examples like that, which are going to be really important. And I think that as a society, as an economy, we're all going to be behaving a bit differently after this than we were before. In terms of what my wife said, you're right. Just so everybody else on the call knows, my wife Dido has been asked to help set up the test, track and trace part of the response to the COVID-19 epidemic. And what that means is that inevitably there will be what we hope will be localized flare-ups in infections. It may be in a particular company, it may be in a particular club or organization, but there will be occasions when there'll start to be spikes, just local ones, in infections. And what we don't want to have is a localized spike in infection turning into a national spread of the disease all over again. And so the answer, the reason why test, track and trace is so important, whether or not my wife's running it or if someone else is running it, whoever is in charge of it, is that what it means is that if we can catch one of those localized flare-ups early and quarantine the people who are part of that flare-up, you don't have to put the entire country into quarantine. You don't have to put the entire country back into lockdown, and that's much better for the reasons we were talking about before, all the costs of lockdown. You don't want to have to go back to that if you can possibly avoid it. So it's really important. Actually, interestingly, of the bit about test, track and trace, what everybody always talks about, which is the new tracking app, which goes on your mobile phone, actually it turns out that bit is everyone's very excited about it because it's a piece of new digital technology. Turns out that's the cherry on the cake. It's much, there's an awful lot of the rest of it, which is much more important and needs to work, and is much less to do with apps and technology and much more to do with getting on the phone to the last 10 people you met and talked to if you just got infected and saying to them, you may be infected, watch out, please behave in the following way. And an awful lot of that is less to do with technology and more to do with just old-fashioned shoe leather and making some phone calls and getting people to behave in the right way and making sure we've got that done in a really systematic and organised way.
Next will be Sophie.
Hello. This is for both of you. What is the biggest achievement you have made in your career as an MP and why?
Well, I mean, I suppose earlier on we answered the question about what things we're most proud of, and locally and nationally gave you some examples. And I think that those are the sort of the biggest achievements in terms of what I've done on behalf of the community, either here in Somerset or up in Westminster. But I guess the biggest achievement actually is probably that getting elected in the first place. I can't tell you what an extraordinary honour it is to put yourself out there for 80,000 people to judge and to know that you've won more votes than anybody else, and therefore you are the one person out of that entire community who then gets to go up and sit in our nation's parliament and speak for this community. And that's an amazing responsibility. It's also a great achievement, and I'm very, very proud of it.
Yeah, Sophie, I'd echo that. I mean, I think probably our answers to that earlier question about achievements is probably are good answers for your question too. And to James's point about the thrill and the honour of getting elected, yeah, I mean, I've made myself a promise, which is if I ever walk into the chamber of the House of Commons in Parliament, and I don't think, wow, I am lucky to be here, and it's a heck of an honour, and I'm just proud of the fact that I'm the person who gets to do this. If I ever don't get that feeling when I walk into the chamber, that's the time I should stop, because that's the time when it stopped being special, and it should always be special.
Finally, we're going to move on to Jack Clark.
Last 2 years, we've seen a rise in young people who are interested in politics. Do you think it's easier for the younger generation to get involved now?
Yeah, I think that it is easier to be engaged in politics now because I think social media is for good or bad, is a very political platform often. And I don't mean that in that it is constantly Conservative, Labour, Lib Dems, Scots, Nats. I just mean that a lot of community and national debate, whether that be yellow lines on a residential road in Whirl, or whether that be whether or not we should leave the European Union, comes out in the way that people talk about stuff on social media. So it's really easy, therefore, to pick up politics with a small p without having to watch Parliament on TV or read the newspaper. I think that brings with it some risk, though, because I think a lot of people don't understand the way that social media works, and that there's an algorithm behind social media that is designed to learn from what you interact with and to show you more of that. And I think that one of the things that we just have here, lots of young people were really confused by the election result last year because everything they could see on social media seemed to agree with their point of view. And so all of a sudden, well, how's this happen? And I think that it is because whilst the great thing is that political conversation, political debate is now much more present in everybody's lives, and it's fantastic that young people are therefore more aware and more engaged, the downside is that the vehicle for that engagement is something that is designed to only show you things you're likely to agree with, and therefore you never see the other side of the argument, or you very rarely see the other side of the argument. And I worry that that brings with it a little bit of sort of a lack of sympathy, a lack of understanding. So we just need to find a way. But it's no bad thing that people are more aware of what the politics are, because I think that makes for a more healthy democracy. John.
James, I completely agree with that. Both the fact that it makes a more healthy democracy, but also that this echo chamber effect can mean that people never get the balance, which is also essential for a democracy too. But I think the other point I'd make is that in some respects it's never been easier because to get involved in politics, not just for young people but for people of any age, because there are now dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of different pressure groups, campaigning organizations, think tanks, all sorts of things, which are in the democratic debate and trying to push opinion in the direction that they think is right. And that means that, and there are just more of them active nationally and locally, perhaps than there have ever been before, because of, James is right, social media amongst other things. And so therefore it's, there's just so many different ways now, so many more ways you can get involved, whether or not you're interested in the environment and green issues, whether or not you're interested in the economy, whether or not you're interested in modern slavery or any of these issues. There will be an organization that you can get involved with, that you can join, probably several organizations, and which will try and give you an opportunity to have your say, to get out there and get involved in whatever way suits you. So you can get involved in sort of single issue politics probably more easily now than for decades, if not longer. The difficulty, of course, is that it's a single issue, and if you're interested in more than one issue, then really you've got to getting involved in a political party is the answer, because that gives you a chance to to make change right the way across the entire country, if that's what votes you vote. I guess the simple answer is if you are interested in more than one issue and you do want to get involved in politics, I don't know if you live in James's constituency or in my constituency, get in touch. I'm sure we can find stuff that will be interesting depending on what you're up for, and we can certainly put you in touch with other people if it's a couple of different issues that you particularly want to do. So let us know. I'm sure we'd be delighted to help.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to Nigel if he has a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. Good afternoon, John. Good afternoon, James. Thanks for giving up your time. A fascinating insight into the world of politics. My question is to both of you. The Ministry of Defence apart, I just wondered how proud you are of the response of the Cabinet, the government and its departments to the problems and the challenges that have been raised by the coronavirus crisis.
And I think the answer is I'm extremely proud of the speed at which action has been taken, and I'm extremely proud of the fact that in a fast-moving, difficult environment where they haven't had anything like enough information, because there's just so many things that we don't know about the way the virus behaves and the way it spreads, and whether or not there's going to be an antibody test soon, and whether or not there's going to be a vaccine that works. So many things that aren't yet known and can't yet be known, and yet they've had to take decisions which are incredibly expensive and affect millions of people's lives really fast, and they've kind of done that, and they've sort of marshaled what's normally a slow, deliberative, careful machine of government, and they've got it to move and got the elephant to dance pretty quickly. So I'm really impressed and proud of that. Have they got it all right all the time? No, absolutely not. I doubt any government has, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of time at our leisure once the dust has settled to work out what could and should have been done differently, and what were honest mistakes which no one could have known, and other things which were less so. So are they perfect? No, absolutely not. Have they done extraordinary things at pace? Yes, they have.
I think I would give almost identical answer. I don't know if you do it in the Priory Learning Trust, but when I was at school, you used to get your half-termly reports. You get a letter for your ability, for your achievement in terms of the quality of your work, and a number for your effort. And and many teachers would argue that the number for the effort was more important. I think that on the effort side, I'm hugely proud. I've been sat in meetings every single day with ministers across government, 7 days a week, seeing the scale of the effort, everything from how do we get from scratch a food delivery service up and running to reach vulnerable people across the country, to how do we tackle a massive requirement for PPE that is way beyond anything that we would have modelled for in our pandemic stockpiles. How do we sort of cope with the complete shutdown of the economy, the requirement to take onto the public payroll tens of millions of people? I mean, this is all phenomenally complex stuff that people have been working absolutely tirelessly to deliver, and I am phenomenally proud of being part of that team, because there are a lot of people who have never done this before in their life. Nobody has, who have worked all hours possible to do their absolute best to come up with a solution to this. When the public inquiry or whatever happens, there is no doubt whatsoever the decisions that all of the decisions have been advice that was available at the time. They've had to be taken under huge pressure, not political pressure, life and death pressure, and people have responded as well as they can to deliver a solution that is I think pretty good. And if you're going to sort of say, oh, well, look at the death rates or whatever else, well, I would say, well, yeah, do look at them per million population, and accept that all around the world people account for deaths in different ways. we won't know for some time yet whether the UK government has been the best in the world at responding to this, the worst in the world at responding to this, or as I suspect, we've been about as good as everybody else at responding to this. But everybody's put in a phenomenal effort, and I've been really proud to be part of that team.
Obviously, the elephant is going to continue to dance for a little while longer. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your answers.
I've got a question, actually. I was really interested when you alluded to being resilient, actually, and talking about, you know, as MPs, as local MPs, you've got to be quite resilient. And I think, you know, part of being resilient is looking after yourself emotionally and physically. And I think as leaders, it's really important to do that. And sometimes I get ridiculed, actually, because I drink a lot of green juice, I take cold showers, I don't drink caffeine. Are you on the same page as me there about looking after yourself physically as well as emotionally?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. James, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go first, because you risk less hypocrisy. You're in much better shape than me.
I was just impressed by the length of time you took to work out what your best sporting achievement was, because there were so many to choose from. As a properly good swimmer in the past, I know you were very good.
That was a former life.
So, Scott, Jackie, yes, absolutely. It's one of the things which some of the old stagers in Parliament tell some of the newer arrivals. You know, I've been in a bit longer than James, but we're both, you know, comparatively new compared to some of them who've been around. Some MPs who've been around for years. Is that if you go back a generation, MPs in general were a lot less healthy than they are now, and yet you would have, you know, a steady trickle of by-elections, I'm sad to say, during the course of a parliament from MPs who just, you know, died before their time, because the place sat very late at night. It was routinely voting at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and people were sitting in the bars drinking all that time, and it just wasn't a healthy place to work. It wasn't a healthy lifestyle. It wasn't good for family life. Lots of divorces and splits and those sorts of things as well. And I don't think it's great now, but I think it's a heck of a lot better. And I think it has to flow through into whether or not MPs do a decent job. I think it applies to any job. That work-life balance and looking after yourself, you know, has to matter, and MPs are no different.
Yeah, I would agree. I would be very honest with you all and say that at the moment I'm just not getting that right. I stay in a hotel when I go up to London, and it tends to mean I sort of eat room service very late at night quite often, and I know it. I know that as the amount of exercise I'm doing and as the quality of the food that I'm eating and when I'm eating it drops off, it has an impact on your mental health, and that has an impact on your ability to maintain balance 7 days a week. And I find, therefore, I put all of my effort into being balanced and making the right decisions in work. And that means at home, I can be a bit grumpy and that then challenging. So I've been very honest with you. I think it's hugely important in any high pressure environment, whether that's politics or whatever else. If you get that balance wrong around your own physical well-being, your own mental well-being, you know, very quickly things elsewhere in your life start to come out of balance, and that's not helpful. So I'm painfully aware of it. Need a haircut, need to lose some weight.
I'm not so sure about the green juice though.
John and James, again, our utmost thanks for your time today. I know you're very busy, gents, so really appreciate it. Thanks to the staff as well. Can we just finish, though, by just 2 minutes of your time further? And I just want to put a couple of students on the spot, because I'm sure you'd be interested to hear this. So Olivia Finch, if you could help us here, and Amy Braithwaite, simply because I know you two students from Worcester and Priory. Olivia, just tell our MPs here, how are you feeling now about the return to school? Have you got any thoughts that they might want to take away with them about return to school and how the last 9 weeks have been as we go into half term? And Amy Braithwaite, same question to you. So Olivia, not too long, busy guys. Over to you, Olivia first.
I'd just like to thank all my teachers for sure. They've all been incredible and setting work and making sure that we're all comfortable at home. But I do really want to get back to school. I'm missing seeing my friends, my teachers, and having the contacts with everyone. Personally, I think when we go back, it will obviously be bit weird, a bit different, but I think we will be able to adapt to it when we get a bit more information about how it's going to look and everything. But I think a lot of, especially seeing I'm a year 10, I've got my exams next year. I'm very keen to get back. I know a lot of my peers are too. So whatever things are put in place to make sure we're safe, I'm pretty sure we all definitely will be comfortable and be able to learn.
All right, okay, and that, on the spot, not scripted as well, by the way, I should just say. So well done, that's fantastic. You'll get communications from Miss Scott this week or early next week about how it's going to work. So thanks, Olivia. Amy, do you want to finish up then? Amy, anything you've got, any concerns you might have about going back to school? Anything you'd like to say as a final minute today?
I don't think concerns as such. It's definitely going to be weird going back to school not being the same as it was before. We never really got to have a last day as such. We never really know what's going to be happening. Didn't know when we were going to be finishing school. But definitely, I think I'm quite lucky in the fact that because I'm year 9, I haven't got any exams coming up. Also, I haven't just come straight into school. So I'm quite settled and haven't really got anything in the future that's really pushing on time. So I think I'm quite lucky there. But it is going to be really weird not seeing my friends and all the social distancing measures. But I think we're all so desperate to get back to school, we will take those measures into place.
Okay, lovely. And I can assure you, teachers and staff, support staff are desperate to get back as well. So thank you for saying that. John and James, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.